Chapter 55. Telling History Unchecked. Wrestling dirt sheet writer Dave Meltzer didn't help matters by starting and perpetuating the asinine myth that I convinced the Great Muta that American fans would never accept a Japanese wrestler as a babyface. I want to take this opportunity to put an end to that insulting, accusatory crap about me and the Great Muta, because a lot of times rumor and innuendo become fact. It's wrong for Meltzer to keep writing that as if it were true, because it isn't, and it makes me sound like a selfish, desperate liar who only had the ability to hang on to the Great Muta's coattails, and I resent that. These days, Dave has become chummy with a lot of wrestlers, but it wasn't always so easy for him. One time Road Warrior Hawk, Steve Williams, and I were standing by the door at the Kaiser Arena in Oakland, California, and someone pointed Dave Meltzer out to us. Hawk hated Dave's guts, so he walked over and told him to leave. Dave would never admit that, though. Things have changed, and now he spends a lot of time with the very wrestlers who tell him things to write about, so how impartial can he really be? In any event, it should be known that Dave Meltzer never bothered to check out what his source, who clearly had an issue with me, claimed I said to the Great Muta before spewing his garbage in that dirt sheet of his, because not once did Meltzer ever call me to confirm it like a real reporter would have done. And that's not a slam, it's the truth. So not only does Dave Meltzer have no journalistic credibility as far as I'm concerned, but he also has zero insight into how I developed the Great Muta, and he clearly isn't aware of my track record, either. By 1989, I had been in the business for a long time and saw firsthand how American fans had consistently accepted plenty of Japanese wrestlers as babyfaces, Duke Kyomakahiro Matsuda, Professor Toru Tanaka, and the Great Kabuki, just to name a few. And it was so obvious to both the Great Muta and I that the American fans were clearly accepting him as a babyface that we would have been denying our own ears for Meltzer's claim, which he has written a couple of times over the years now, to hold any water. I suppose Meltzer thinks I was some kind of mysterious Svengali with a magical hold over the Great Muta, and could sell him the Brooklyn Bridge if I wanted, but give the Great Muta some credit. The only thing I ever tried to convince the Great Muta was, you can do this, you can make a lot of money, just take care of the gimmick. I love wrestling fans. They made me a great living for many years, so I say this with no disrespect, but for some reason, certain fans have become so markified when it comes to Meltzer that he is looked at as the premier wrestling journalist and historian, even though he's nothing more than a mark trying to crack smart. This self-appointed authority on wrestling has made a very nice living out of just writing what people tell him without doing any corroborating research. Now if he chooses to handle his reporting that way, fine, but the next time you read one of his newsletters, keep his journalistic integrity, or lack thereof, in mind, because, as his lack of follow-up on my story has proven, he clearly hasn't realized that his sources are more than likely working him for their own benefit, and to get back at people they don't like in the industry. I have no issue with journalists or historians. However, a true journalist would bother to speak with both sides of a story before making potentially damaging and baseless accusations. And they wouldn't allow others to treat them as a puppet or mouthpiece for their own agenda. And if someone is purporting to write a history of a territory, they should at least take the time to do some research and demonstrate they understand the subject they are discussing, and maybe even interview the people who were there in order to get a proper perspective. In order to help the sales of his floundering newsletter, he once wrote a history of world class that was full of inaccuracies because he was probably in such a rush to meet his weekly deadline that he didn't care enough to speak with Bill Mercer, Mickey Grant, Kevin Von Erich, or myself. I don't know who he spoke with in order to get his erroneous information, because whoever he did is reinventing history and is attempting to defame the people who actually built world class. If you ever want to know who Meltzer's stooges are, just look and see who he writes gloriously about. For instance, in his World Class History issue, he claimed it was Ric Flair who made the Von Erich boys. So with all their sellouts since Kevin's debut in 1976, they were nothing until Ric Flair entered the picture. Not only does that statement show Meltzer's ignorance, but it also pisses in the face of guys like Mark Lewin, Tim Brooks, and Don Jardine, and even Harley Race, for that matter. Harley was having sellouts with the Von Erich boys long before Rick ever got the NWA title, and by no means am I attempting to diminish Rick's contribution to the Von Erich boys' success. As I have detailed in this book, he was a very important cog in the wheel, but to suggest he was the only cog without mentioning anyone else, to me, reeks of an agenda. He also got his personal attack in on me when he basically accused me of lying about how I brought the fabulous Freebirds to Texas in 1982, suggesting that perhaps I booked a match with them in 1983, right after saying I wasn't even there in 1983. Meltzer's version is that Michael Hayes came to San Antonio and then recruited Terry Gordy and Buddy Roberts once he saw how good business was. I certainly hope Michael isn't one of Dave's sources, because why he would lie about what I did for his career is beyond me. And how Meltzer could write that Mickey Grant wasn't a player in world class, and give the production credit to Keith Mitchell instead, makes no sense. Keith Mitchell was Mickey's assistant, and merely pulled cables for the handheld cameras. The only thing I can surmise is that Keith is one of Dave's stooges, and if that is the case, then Keith has seriously padded his resume and pulled the wool over Dave's eyes, because for anyone to minimize Mickey's influence on that show is a joke. Dave has also continuously defined Texas pre-1983 as a small, sleepy, struggling playground. He considers Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, Odessa, Midland, Lubbock, Amarillo, El Paso, San Angelo, Abilene, Tyler, and Albuquerque a small territory. I booked that territory from June 1976 through January 1983, and with his revisionism, one must wonder why, if it was such a struggling territory, I wasn't fired. Instead, I ended up with one of the longest continuous serving tenures of any booker. And I was paid very well based on the weekly attendances, and would love to know when this lull that he is always talking about happened. Meltzer also wrote that I wasn't being accurate in recounting the death of my friend Bruiser Brody. He has a lot of gall to make a comment like that, and then turn around and write fictionalized tales about how Brody quit his job as booker of World Class because of the way Fritz promoted the memorial show, and about how Fritz von Erich had a war with Ed McLemore in the 1960s. Those two stories are beyond inaccurate, they're totally made up. I explained earlier in the book exactly how Brody lost his job as booker, and believe me when I tell you that Fritz and Ed had a very tight connection from the day they met until the day Ed died in 1969. So while Dave Meltzer sits around and rewrites history, he has the balls to accuse other people of telling history unchecked. In giving his history lesson, Meltzer also got in some cheap shots about Fritz hitting his son, Mike, and about Sunshine having a nervous breakdown, which amount to nothing more than vicious, unsubstantiated hearsay. Dave Meltzer makes himself out to be something really special when he's nothing more than a gossip monger, even below Rona Barrett. And yes, I knowingly threw that name in there just to torment him, because he has this bizarre hang-up with dated references. And this is a phobia coming from a so-called historian, mind you. I had to laugh when he wrote how Fritz von Erich wrestled Gene Kiniski at Texas Stadium in 1968, because Texas Stadium didn't even open until 1971. It would have been so easy for him to check on that. And why he didn't even bother to do a simple Google search is beyond me. The fact that one of his paying readers had to point that out to him a week later is downright pathetic. Now if you think that's just a minor point, think again. If a supposed historian could make such a huge blunder like that without realizing it, imagine how much else he gets wrong. Dave Meltzer alleges that he used to be a newspaper reporter in Wichita Falls. Well, now we know why he didn't last at that job. I would say he's a complete fraud, but if he does have one accomplishment, it's in his ability to con a couple of thousand wrestling fans out of almost $3 apiece each week to read his bullshit newsletter. Anyhow, getting back to 1989 just to show that I wasn't clinging to the Great Muta for selfish or monetary reasons, I will share with you this story. While all of the nonsense was going on with the booking committee, Steve Harms had a very dear friend named Leon White, who, as I detailed earlier, was wrestling in Japan as Big Van Vader. One night after the matches in Denver, Colorado, Leon, Steve, and I went out to dinner. Vader wanted to come to the NWA, and asked if I would manage him. I told Leon that I would love to have an opportunity with him, but I was still in the building process with the Great Muta. Right now I could not do you justice, I explained to Leon. I'm devoting all my time and energy to the Great Muta. However, I think you will be perfect for the NWA, and I will personally take your tape and give it to Jim Barnett. I'm sure he will bring you in. I did take the tape, and Vader did come in. I could have managed Sid Vicious and Danny Spivey at the time, as well, but I wasn't greedy. I truly wanted to continue developing the Great Muta, and wanted to give him all of my attention.